Welcome to the Expert Network Team podcast,
where our goal is to inform and educate listeners on matters of finance, legal, insurance, and other interests that are of personal and business nature.
We hope you enjoy the information contained in today's podcast and find it useful.
We'd like to introduce your Expert Network team of professionals.
I'm Karl Frank, owner and financial planner at A&I Wealth Management. I work with clients to help them grow and protect their investments and choose how they want to be taxed.
I'm Jeff Cromendike, a managing principal of One Digital Insurance. I work with individuals and businesses to help them understand their risk exposure and lead them to risk transfer solutions that best fit their needs.
I'm Nathan Merrill, founder and attorney at Goodspeed Merrill, providing advanced tax strategy and private client legal services to affluent families and entrepreneurs.
Together, our independent team combines our expertise to provide you insights and solutions, some straightforward, some profound, addressing real-life opportunities we see on a daily basis.
If you'd like to learn more or desire to meet with any of the Expert Network team professionals in person, you can contact us at info@expertnetworkteam.com. That's info@expertnetworkteam.com.
We encourage you to take advantage of a free consultation with any of our professionals. Just mention this podcast when you schedule your appointment.
Without further delay, please enjoy today's podcast.
Welcome to today's podcast. I'm Karl Frank here with Nate Merrill. I'm from A&I Wealth Management, and Nate's from Goodspeed Merrill. How are you, Nate?
Last time I checked, at least.
I hope you're still employed.
I'll check. Yeah, payday's coming here in a few days.
That's a different topic.
No, for those who might think I'm forecasting something, I'm not. I'm just being stupid. So,
yeah, I think that they're pretty lucky to have you, my friend.
Yeah. Well, It's my passion, and I like being there. I like the people that we've got as part of the team.
Your firm is doing great. We need to have a conversation just about that and your growth and the way you're managing people. It just seems from the outside looking in, looks like you're doing just a fantastic job.
Yeah. Looks can be deceived. No.
Our firm is doing great. I love my people.
Yeah.
We're having a good time.
Well,
It's an interesting year.
Since the move to this office space, though, you're developing a different culture, I think, than you had previously, aren't you?
Thank you. I think that's a good point. Yeah. And it is becoming a little bit, even though we're not biologically family, we're a family of affinity.
There we go. What's that? What do you call that in comedy where you do a callback to a prior joke? That's a callback to a prior podcast episode.
Yeah. It's a transition to our topic today where we're going to talk about the recent podcast we did where we had a guest who I wasn't able to be a part of, Roy Diffendorf, and we're talking about family as an asset. And so I'm familiar with it. I've read the books. And I'm excited to talk with Nate about the impact this might be having on your life and quite frankly, on my family and our financial assets as well. Our intention is to have a really deep conversation today, but also fun.
So let me start it out with the big, deep question. And this, again, for listeners who might not have listened to, I think it was part 2 of our conversation with Roe. He talks about, and Karl, you just alluded to this, money or family as an asset class. And that epiphany that they had came out of talking with families and realizing that they were just focusing on building the bank account or the balance sheet.
Right.
All their investment decisions were about building the balance sheet, which implies at some level that a bigger balance sheet solves all problems. And in reality, what they were finding was bigger balance sheets contributed to problems. I don't want to say caused problems because it harkens back to the proverbial saying or the scriptural saying of money, or it often gets abbreviated to money is the root of all evil.
Right.
But it's really the true way it reads is the love of money is the root of all evil.
Right.
And so functionally, I think that's what we're going to be drilling down on today is that discussion of when does building the balance sheet detract from the real goal of building the family, or how can these two exist?
And what can we do?
Coexist.
And what can we do if things go wrong? And how can we help make sure that it's going right?
Right.
I liked one of the simple lines I heard from the podcast, which was, we often want to prepare prepare the assets for the heirs, but really it's about preparing the heirs
for the assets.
to handle the assets.
Right. And in order to do that, that's where they came up with family as an asset class, is to say, if we're gonna build this balance sheet, we need to devote some of these assets to activities and resources that support the family. Things like we've talked about in the past, family reunions, and how those are really organized and executed.
That's some great ideas.
Can be much more than just Saturday at the park, as I think you and I talked about, the old Chicago song. So the assets come in handy in fortifying the family and like you say, preparing the family to receive the wealth. Because, and this is the question he said he began to realize the clients were asking them that they weren't answering. And I can attest that it often comes up in the estate planning context, is like, what can I do to prevent this wealth from being a detriment to my family?
How can I avoid my family being torn apart by the money? So
let's talk about that, because the way you say that, I think, is an important expression of the concern, is torn apart. How does money, if you were to express that concern, Karl, how would money tear apart the family?
Oh, it could be horrible. So
how does it do that? Like, because money is an inanimate object,
you'd think
right?
It wouldn't, right? Yeah, you'd think it wouldn't. But if you've got a couple of kids, let's say even just two, and they're very different from each other, which we often talk about in our family, is how can the same gene pool yield such random, amazingly different results, right? But one of them might be a spendthrift and the other might be the opposite. And so one is very skilled with money and one is very unskilled with keeping the money. And so you fear that the spendthrift might just blow the money. And so you put a trust or another document to protect them from themselves. And that could actually really harm the relationships in the family if the other one didn't have to have those rules around their money. Another way that, and say they're both responsible. But a common thing that I've seen with families is some of the legal documents could say, well, one of the many children, perhaps, or even in this case, just two, is in charge and the others aren't. And that can cause some feelings of resentment. And it can also mean that there could be some feelings of embarrassment if one of the other kids who's not in charge asks for money and they have to open up their kimono to a younger brother, let's say, or whatever the situation might be. It can really harm families. It can really harm families. And if there are any already differences with children, as we age, we sometimes remember some of the stupidest fights that we've had with some of our siblings from the youngest ages, and we never really forget it. And our older sibling still thinks they're better than we are, even if we're closer.
Or we think they think. Or it doesn't even have to be real. It just has to be perceived, right?
The money can exaggerate even the smallest of arguments that may or may not even exist. It can bring them up to the surface, and feelings that we didn't even know we had could resurface in ways that are surprisingly unpleasant. And sometimes when they're voiced, it can be a separation that can be irreconcilable, as sad as that sounds.
Right.
And so money can really exaggerate for the better or for the worse, but without help, it tends to yield worse results.
Right. Well, I'm going to break down a couple of things you point out there, because all those things I think are very real examples of how, wealth as an inheritance can impact the strength and longevity of family relationships. Some of those have nothing to do with money. Like you say, the money becomes the amplifier of sorts of more deep-seated issues that have never been addressed. So how could one ever think that money could solve that problem? Making your balance sheet bigger will never solve that problem. So that's obviously one that has to be addressed. And I think these are the important conversations or things for people to realize is, look, if I just make my kids all millionaires, they're going to all get along. I don't know if someone actually believes that, but that's how we behave.
We behave in that way. And that's totally, I don't think anybody believes that.
Right.
Really? I mean, do you really?
So thus, if our families exhibit those tendencies where there's deeper seated issues, and I don't mean deep seated like psychosis or something like that, but just relationship problems that date back to the early years of adolescence or whatever
happened,
those have to be addressed before any amount of money can be assuredly passed on without causing problems, because there again, money's just acting as the amplifier for the underlying disharmony.
Exactly. And that's a tough situation. And you know what? You need to kind of face that head on.
Right.
You don't want to run away from that, pretend it doesn't exist.
And that's not something I necessarily particularly view myself adept at being an advisor on. And right. And that's where we bring in folks like the Diefendorf and Sean Barbera's partnership, where they do have a platform to help families strengthen communication, at least bring those to the surface so they can be addressed. Then you decide if you need a family psychologist to come in and help people work through their issues or not.
But wonderfully skilled people out there to help with that relationship.
Those are important issues to address before you really consider transferring any balance sheet of any size, because it could be, it's funny. I think we've talked about this sometimes in estate divisions. It's not even the money that brings these things to the surface. It's you got the wedding ring, or you got it can be the things that are transmitted,
we
right?
have talked about that. Absolutely. It's so true.
And it's not about the wedding ring. It's about something else. And so families who intend to have a legacy have first got to honestly address those things, identify and address those things, so that the money doesn't become the destroyer of the family. So then let's say you have a very good, harmonious family. You've done a great job at bringing up adult children that communicate and express themselves well. And so you feel confident you can now pass wealth. So the other thing you point out is not every child's created equal in terms of ability or skill. So here again, I think is where communication is key. Not leaving it to the documents. As well as I can draft a document,
I like that.
Not leaving it to documents to express to one child or another why they're getting the type of trust structure. If one's got spendthrift and one doesn't, communication is the only way to overcome that. If you don't address that before you're gone, no amount of lawyering in the world is going to help that child who got the spendthrift trust feel like they were ever trusted or appreciated.
Exactly. And that can be, that's not an easy skill.
Or maybe they didn't marry well. Maybe we're trying to protect them from an abusive spouse, or, it could be any number of things. Communication, it still comes back to communication, I think.
Right. Yeah. It's a huge part of it. And I think that what they're providing in those previous podcasts are ways to handle some of the in a technological way, some ways of communicating even after you're gone.
Yeah.
And that can be really beneficial.
True.
Absolutely really beneficial.
The old video will concept,
and other things that will help the values persist. One of the things that my wife and I are taking out of these conversations is, in our own lives, we want to pass the values and the stories and the heritage, and it's so rich, and we get so much value from that. We'd feel remiss if we didn't pass that wealth on to our next generation. Right. And I think that's a big part of what we're talking about.
Yeah, and that's one of those where I can share my personal story. This was my personal epiphany not about 8 years ago, was when I realized, and I think I've talked a little bit about this on previous podcasts, but my great-grandfather has an incredible history in terms of early stages of the frontier Utah, as it were, and my great-great-grandfather on top of that. Much of that history was lost to me because of its failure to transmit from at least my father to me, possibly my grandfather to my father, because they emphasized different things. They emphasized the accumulation of wealth and prosperity rather than the sacrifices and the stories and the achievements of prior generations. They were more focused on what are you going to do to succeed than recognizing that we had a legacy of success. And so it got to me, and I was in my mid-40s by the time I realized all this stuff had actually been accomplished.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Wealth of achievement. Yeah, not necessarily, I got nothing from it. But
not financially.
But it changed my perspective. I think that's what I've mentioned, is once I realized that was my history, it changed my perspective on what my future might be.
Wow, it changed your life.
Yeah. And the other thing I want to point to what you're saying earlier is
incredible value there. There's just incredible value in knowing the stories and passing that on, and it'll help with the wealth. It'll help with the wealth building. Again,
it provides the foundation, because you can't build a 100-story building on a weak or shallow foundation.
Right.
You need a foundation upon which to create or pass a legacy, a financial legacy. if that foundation is weak, if people don't know who they are, you talk about it being values, people can use different words to express it. But the who, what, why, and how of their existence, if they're not confident in that, again, why would you give someone who's unsure about where they want to go in life any kind of significant amplification to that lack of direction? Because if you add amplification to that lack of personal direction, what are you going to get? You're going to get more direction.
More problems.
Right. So,
and yet you're going to have competing desires, because on the other hand, there is this fairness issue.
Yeah, it's funny you say fairness, because that's the exact next word that came to my mind.
Right. And so how do you make that? And that conversation is probably, I'm going to jump to the conclusion, but I really want your insights before I do. It's going to be unique to each person you're talking to.
Well, my answer to your question is going to be a question, because we all think of fairness as something that is good. What is it, though?
Yeah.
Define fairness.
Right.
Has your life always been fair? I mean, and I'm not playing victim or anything, but I don't think fairness has anything to do personally. Maybe this is now where I'm like really branching out into extreme.
I don't know. I think playing devil's advocate is really going to help solidify our listeners' thoughts and mine. I mean, I certainly feel like I've got to come to the plate here and think.
Yeah, I don't know that fairness. Is it fair that the folks in Florida right now are getting hit with a major storm surge?
It's totally unfair. Or is it fair because they chose to live there? Probably.
Well, and again, that's where, in order to understand what fair is, and the phrase I always use with my clients is, what's fair is not always equal, and what's equal is not always fair. Because is it fair that Michael Jordan was blessed with extraordinary, physical attributes that allow
really powerful mother? I love this new movie about Jordan where she negotiated for him to get that deal. I don't know if you've seen this movie. It's great.
But on the flip side of that, I'm sure he had sufferings and challenges that I haven't had to face. So what's unfair?
Right?
What's unfair? Is it
He
unfair
worked a little
that
harder than we did at playing basketball? Yeah. That's a really great example.
It's getting out of the comparison game to say, well, this isn't fair to me because I can find 50 things that might not be fair to me that were unfair to you that I've had the advantage of. Or something like
exactly.
That. So fairness is not something that is a life measurement tool. It will always lead you, in my mind, down a dead end.
Right.
If fairness is going to be the measure by which you assess whether something is right or wrong in your life, it's an impossibility.
I love that. How do you address the challenge of fairness? Well, and that's a great conversation because it's going to be a unique answer that everybody's going to have. Some people are going to come back at you with other ideas that are better than mine to defend the idea of fairness in their family. And my response to that might be just to concede and say, yeah, you know what, maybe fairness isn't the right question at all. Maybe that's not the way I should be thinking about this at all. And it's certainly not equal, right? Just to divide everything equally across, purse strippies and bloodline only. And
those used to be like the defaults if you didn't know what to do. I
think it kind of is.
So let's talk a little bit about that, because that's where we were kind of spitballing around before we started this discussion was, so what do you do? And maybe this is a long enough topic for us to close out this podcast. Now that you've done everything you can do to create a harmonious family, and you got on the right path, now you're gone, and or the plan you're designing is for when you're gone, and sometime after you're gone, that harmonious family you left behind starts to bicker and fight about the money. What is the proper response at that time? Now you have the money or some relationship to the money. Again, I don't necessarily ever believe it's really the money that's the problem. It's usually the money's being made the problem by some other externality. But let's just assume, what's the solution? And you and I were spitballing a couple of different ideas here. There's the one approach of just saying, well, if the money's going to be the problem, let's just divide it up and let them all go their separate ways. Good idea, bad idea, or what kind of idea is that?
That is a question to end the podcast with and let our listeners think about. And let's bring that up on our next podcast.
That sounds fine for me.
Hey, everybody, create a beautiful day.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed the discussion and the information we shared.
We hope you enjoy the information contained in today's podcast and find it useful.
We hope you will join us again next time as we explore new areas of interest to our listeners or current issues we believe are important to discuss.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe so you are notified when future episodes are released, and also share it with a friend that you think would benefit.
If you'd like to meet with a member of the Expert Network team or have a request for a special topic you'd like to have us discuss on the podcast, submit those requests to info@expertnetworkteam.com. That's info@expertnetworkteam.com.
Thank you for joining us and have a great day.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. We want to remind you that listening to this podcast does not establish a client-professional relationship with any of the professional firms represented, including guests, nor does it constitute legal, investment, accounting, or other advice of a fiduciary nature. The views expressed are those of the professionals only.
Investment advisor services may be provided through A&I Wealth Management. Securities may be provided through Genios Wealth Management.